What I realize is when you talk about these really basic theoretical propositions, what you're describing is the foundation of not just Chinese medicine, but Chinese thinking. That's not to say that all thinking in China comes from or even relates to this, but much does. It's common to find it. So there's a rationale. It's not just arbitrary. There's a very important aspect of Chinese, of the sort of approach to aesthetics and how to assemble structures, has to do with numbers in China. The Chinese have been bean counters. They're farmers. You can imagine them saving seeds and just keeping track of the things that you have to manage in order to make what we would think of as a primitive farm work. And of course, there were great investigators of human nature. So these structures that they derived from all this management and investigation of their situation it takes on an orderly and recognizable pattern. What I tried to arrange on this chart was a presentation of these concerns, along with what I think of as the basic framework of what modern scholars have referred to as systems in correspondence, or systematic correspondence. Paul Unschild, a German historian of Chinese medicine, refers to what we refer to as Chinese medicine as the medicine of systematic correspondences. So, what is this idea of correspondence? What does it mean to have systems in correspondence? What is the human mind meant to do? It's not particularly important in the management of the body, except in adjusting the body to its environment. But it's particularly important in anticipation, in prediction. Bucky Fuller, you'll notice on this thing I sent you that Bucky Fuller's the only name that I jotted down in making my note in the modern sources. Bucky had a very interesting and I think useful definition of consciousness. He referred to consciousness as pattern integrity recognition. It's that awareness that emerges from noticing patterns. Mathematics is the science of patterns. And words and numbers represent a very fundamental expression of the essence of our consciousness. Our consciousness largely exists in order to try and make accurate predictions about the future. The present, we are a stimulus response machine. We're hardwired, so to speak, to react to real-time experience. But what we've developed as a really potent survival enhancer is this capacity to predict the future. How do we do it?
Patterns.
We do it by seeing patterns. We know what comes next in this pattern. So if you are a pragmatist, what can you say about the world? Most fundamentally, what the Chinese came up with is the statement that everything changes. But these changes take place in knowable and predictable patterns. And one of the best ways to codify these patterns is through numbers. Hence, the emergence of what I'm calling a cosmological map. Cosmos means order. It's the word that comes from ancient Greece to describe the implicit order of existence, the universe. In the ancient Greek idea, as well as in the ancient Chinese idea, this fundamental order comes from emptiness. The Greeks called emptiness chaos. In making a word, what does one do? One has a thought, and one maps the thought verbally. A word is a fundamental level of map. The nervous system creates a particular pattern of synaptic connections And that is a word. We associate the word and the concept. That's how we find our way through a series or sequence of meanings. And we develop this fantastic capacity to communicate. So, what have we talked about? We've talked about Taiji and Yin Yang and Qi and Tao. We've covered these numbers 0, Wuji, Taiji, as the Wang Song classic says, comes from Wuji and is the mother of Yin and Yang. So we've referred to this 0 level of this map. We've considered the oneness of Taiji as the mother of Yin and Yang, the two-ness representative of Yin and Yang, the three-ness of Qi. We've touched upon, though I think we'll devote one entire talk to, the notion of time, which is what? A recognition of a fundamental category of patterns. The ancient Chinese notion and experience of time was the ongoing correlation of human activity with the basic pattern of heat and light and dark and cold. The 4 seasons. Sishi and Taichi. Time, in other words, was a circle. A pattern of heat and light coming and going throughout the year that was knowable and predictable. That's a key important fact. This was not just abstract and arbitrary knowledge about the world. This was knowledge about the way your environment worked, which you had to be master of in order to survive, in order to know when to plant, in order to know when to reap, in order to know how to adjust human activity and natural activity. This kind of pressure gives rise to the whole way of thinking that we see expressed in a compilation like the Suen, the Yellow Emperor's Classic. The basic principle encountered throughout that text is the notion that there is a law, and for law, you can just understand an embrace of all-encompassing pattern of patterns. And if you live in accordance with that law, you survive. If you transgress that law, you die. Very simple. And very useful to the ongoing organization and management of life that took place in these remotely ancient times. Farmers.
What was 1? I had 0, 2, 3, 4, but I didn't get 1.
Uji is 0. 1 I would say is Taiji.
Okay.
1 is the extreme limit.
Okay.
The threshold. We waited 1 minute for you.
Pause just a second. I got to move where that microphone is because.
So we've now arrived at step 5 of this sequence. That's when I realized, oh, we really need to describe the bigger pattern, because the parts take on their meaning from the way they fit into the larger picture. Uh, 5. What?
Phases? Elements?
Look at what a person is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Five. There's something palpable about 5. I would go so far as to say that part of its numerological significance is that 5 represents the self. Why should this be the location in the sequence of the theory of the 5 phases? Well, to answer this, you have to really dig into what is the 5 phases meant to be. It's a description of a metaphor whose metaphorical parts are arranged in such a way as to describe the ongoing cycling of the material world. Remember, what lies at the root of this ongoing cycling? Yin and yang. But we're getting more and more complex. We're admitting more and more to the explicit level of experienced reality, the world of the 10,000 things. So we need conceptual tools that will help us model and describe and map these more complex levels of structure and function. Five does that. The first set of relationships that we think of as the five phases is what is known as the generative sequence. The giving birth cycle, which is what? Fire gives birth to earth. So, how do we understand that metaphor? That the fire gives birth to earth. Let's look at the whole sequence of such metaphorical propositions and then see if we can deduce what is the pattern. The fire gives birth to earth. Earth gives birth to metal. Metal gives birth to water. Water gives birth to wood. Wood gives birth to fire. You have a complete set of metaphors that describe the cycling of the material world. Things in the world flow, they interact, they interpenetrate, they interchange. We're constantly doing this. We're taking parts of the world in and breaking it down and taking up the components and passing things out. We flow the world through us as we flow through the world. Literally fabricating our bodies out of the world that we're moving through. How does this take place? Well, five-phase theory is an attempt to abstract this pattern You know, this phrase, this Chinese phrase, wuxing, is often known in English as five elements. This way of thinking of it really emphasizes the noun aspect of the terms of the metaphors. Five phases, on the other hand, tends more to emphasize their verbal character. And indeed, it's more accurate to understand the relationships described in this larger and more complex metaphor as actions, functions, operations, not as objects. You know, these astrophysicists have made this huge discovery last week of an event that happened some 130 million years ago, the collision of two neutron stars. And they've been able to do what they do great, detect and measure and so on. Why did I think of them?
Well, it probably started something that's going to go through phases.
Or actions as opposed to nouns.
That was going to be a good one. It will come back to me. Now, of course, I can't think of anything else.
Do you think that referring to them as the five elements limits your understanding, maybe because of that aspect of it being more of a noun versus?
Well, I don't know that the reference limits, but the reference, the use of elements as the cognate for wuxing reflects a lack of understanding.
Yeah. Which is common in English, because even you say action, that's a noun. You say process, that's a noun. It's really hard to avoid thinking in nouns in English, in, I guess, European languages.
Those darn nouns. Okay, well, I'm going to let that go. So, we've got this notion that the fire generates earth. What is being described? The constituents of the natural environment are all, in sum, engaged in this ongoing cycling, fundamental movements. Trees take up this earth and turn it into wood. The wood gives birth to fire. That's pretty easy and obvious to see. That wood is the fuel from which fire emerges. And the fire does what? it returns the wood in the form of ash back to the ground. What happens in the earth? What is the earth? The earth is the condensation of this material. Oh yeah, so one of the things that these astrophysicists discovered, now I remember what I was thinking of them for, was the origins of gold and platinum and heavy metals. They are the product of these collisions of super neutron stars.
How many years ago was this?
130 million years ago. You may have been otherwise engaged.
I was there.
Well, what better metaphor, what better experience represents the metaphor of fire than the collision of neutron stars? That's a big fire.
Oh, okay. And it created the heavy elements, the heavy metals.
Do you understand the basic sequence of stars, star formation? Without getting too technical, there's area and there's mass. The ratio of mass to area influences the way that the fundamental forces that exist in the physical universe manifest themselves. The weakest of the four fundamental forces is gravity. Gravity is mass attraction. When you get a certain amount of mass and a certain amount of area, volume, the gravity begins to express itself in a way that overcomes the other stronger forces. This is a mathematical reality. It's a reality that can be measured mathematically.
When the mass gets large enough, is that what you're saying?
When the mass gets large enough, the weakest of the four forces now is primed to overcome the stronger forces.
Okay, and what are the stronger forces?
There's the nuclear force. The nuclear force is the force that binds the nucleus of the atom together. There's the electromagnetic force. The electromagnetic force is the force that generates by the orbit of electrons around the nucleus. And there's something that's called the weak force, which is actually quite powerful but operates at infinitesimally small subatomic distances. So what happens that results in the ignition of a star is an adequate amount of mass provides the energy basis for the ignition of the nuclear furnace that causes the release of the nuclear force.
So it's kind of like that?
Yes. Just like that. It's the yin and yang.
Yang is a force.
Yang is the outgoing force, yin is the...
I missed the second half of that. Enough in star formation, when enough mass comes together, provides the energetic basis for
the overcoming of the nuclear, the weak force, and electromagnetic force by gravity. Now you can look around in the sky and categorize stars according to where they fall on this spectrum of possible ratios of mass and volume. There's stars like our sun. There are stars that are way more massive. There are stars that are so massive that this tendency to compress matter has collapsed the electron and the proton into neutrons. They're called neutron stars. At a mass of approximately, we'll say, a solar mass, what's going on is the attraction of gravity is strong enough to cause a detonation of the nuclear force and a release of, well, everything that gets shot out of that fusion reaction. You're jamming hydrogen atoms together and creating helium and heavier elements. So this recent discovery was of the collision of two neutron stars. Neutron stars are these vastly massive kinds of stars. I heard one report that said in a galaxy with the stellar population of the one like ours, in 1 million years, maybe 12 such supermassive stars. That speaks to the rarity of these things. Yet they're very powerfully energetic events. And it's where gold comes from. The gold that exists on Earth was not made on Earth.
Really? Wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's the detritus of these collisions.
It makes you think about how all of these cultures are so attracted to gold. And it's been used for so many like spiritual purposes, or like, you know, really sacred things are created in gold.
Which other metals did you say?
Platinum.
Platinum.
I can only partially understand what you're saying. Are there, I'm putting you on the spot here, but like good DVDs or something, what is the best way to learn more about this?
Go to YouTube
Mm-hmm.
and just search for phrases like star formation.
Okay.
So the gold, you know, you're saying that the collision created the gold, and then the gold must have reached the earth for like a, and deposited itself, right, into the earth.
Yeah, how did that transition happen? Just
These massive stellar explosions take place, and the radiation is always 360 degrees. So this stuff is just spewed out into the cosmos. Other forces come to bear, and that dispersion, expansion is, shall we say, offset by later contractions. Throughout the physical world, things tend to move from areas of greater concentration to areas of lesser concentration. The point I'm trying to give some flesh to the metaphorical notions that the Chinese developed that we call the 5 phases. As modern science begins to explore these methods by which the universe creates its self and its contents, that's just what the Chinese were doing. The Chinese didn't have the kind of extended perceptual abilities that modern scientists have, but they arrived at an understanding that there is a knowable pattern to the cycling of the material world. In the case of using this metaphor as a basis for medical theory, we've got a model in Chinese medicine which associates the 5 principal internal organs with these 5 phases. Such that the liver is associated with the wood phase. The kidney is associated with the water phase. The heart is associated with the fire phase. The lungs are associated with the metal phase. And the spleen is associated with the earth. As if the theoretical proposition is, okay, if in general we can use 5 phases to describe this abstract, fundamental pattern of the way that the material world cycles itself, how does that take place in the human body? The lungs, in other words, are engaged in an ongoing effort to encounter and incorporate the metal phase. What do we really mean by that? Well, how do we get metal out of the earth? The earth gives birth to metal. But how do people interrelate with that fact? Well, we mine it. We dig it up. We refine it. We take the ore and we heat it. We purify it. In fact, we do what the lungs do with the air. We take in the bulk sample material and we process it to remove the valuable portion.
So, so in the five element theory, air is not an element. Okay.
Right. Similarly, the kidneys process water. Water is taken into the body and refined by the kidneys. The wood phase, conducted by the liver, provides what? The best description of the wood phase that I can remember from my earlier schooling is that it's the blade of grass that grows up through the concrete. It's that marshaling and focusing of the yang up and out that's precise enough and potent enough to break the stone with a very soft sprout.
And the wood phase is associated with the liver.
With the liver.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
In what direction?
I'm trying to understand how the liver is associated with the wood phase.
Good question. There's how it came to be and how we experience it. From a clinical perspective, how we experience it is that if you think of the liver as the repository of the irresistible force of life. The creative drive, in modern terms, you think of it as the urge to replicate. It's driven right out of our genes, reproduce, that drives us towards sexual reproduction. The potency, the force with which we are motivated in this direction is the wood phase.
Okay.
Much of the angst of modern life, as described by Freud in Civilization and its Discontents, is the ongoing encounter between that creative drive and the immovable objects it runs into in society. Hence you wind up with what Freud called neurosis, which in Chinese medicine is probably best described as stagnation.
Yeah. Yeah. Repeating behavior patterns that do not work.
Is that what you meant? The spleen.
Which I have only a very vague idea of the spleen and what it does.
In the Chinese physiological context, what we mean by spleen and stomach is represented by the phrase the sea of grain and water.
Green.
Grain and water. The food and water that we eat are stored in the spleen and transformed and transported by the spleen system. The spleen, in other words, is the basis of transformation and transportation in the body. That the body is capable of undergoing transformation and transportation depends upon the spleen. This is the earth phase. It's the way in which we're able to connect to the world substantially. The loading dock.